NUZHAT SULTAN. I am the Director and Curator of Visual Arts and Museum Affairs at the Women's National Democratic Club, founded in 1922. First of all, I want to thank Helen Frederick for inviting me to moderate, Linika Jacob and Kala Chaupal and the Institut Français for providing this excellent series of webinars. Our session today is titled Glowing in the Dark in Rural Recognitions. Today, I'm honored to be with three distinguished panelists from three different cultures. This is especially interesting to me since I've been exposed to different cultures since childhood. It made me look at my own culture deeply and particularly how my culture was viewed abroad. I will keep my introductions very brief, even though our esteemed panelists have extensive biographies so that they have more time to speak. Françoise Verges is our first guest. Françoise Verges is an eminent scholar, author, activist, and academic. She was born in Paris of Vietnamese Réunionnais parents and a French mother, both anti-colonial politicians and activists who went to Réunion Island when Françoise was barely 2 years old. Françoise is an anti-racist and anti-capitalist decolonialist feminist. She is the author of more than 10 books, including her latest, The Wombs of Women, Race, Capital, Feminism. Among her many activities to fight with women in the global South, the previously colonized and people of color, Françoise has also dedicated herself to working for many years with artists of color from different cultures. She is the co-founder of the collective Decolonize the Arts, whose objective is to develop decolonial methodologies and new pedagogies of teaching, but also to reflect on decolonial aesthetics, representations, on decolonializing museums and collections, and imagining new forms of narration. Françoise, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening. Thank you for inviting me for this contribution. So I was told that we have to keep our remark in 10 minutes. So I will try to be brief. Well, in fact, the title, I want to make three remarks. First, about the title, Glowing in the Dark, Rural Recognition. And because talking effectively with Dr. NUZHAT, we were talking about the question of glowing and light and enlightenment that the West has been using in terms, like to civilize the darker people. And of course, and through slavery, colonization, and a hierarchy of knowledge. And so I was thinking of reversing that, and I thought that was the idea, in fact, of the organizer. And what is the light in current darkness today? With the darkness being the massive destruction of the environment, the racism, the homophobia, the murder of women everywhere, the femicide, the poverty, the exploitation, the patriarchy, the commodification, the present being almost like the past. So what is the light in this, current darkness? Is the global mobilization, I would say, and also this movement called Black Lives Matter that was started in 2013. The fact that looking at the lives that have been made really vulnerable, disposable, and saying they matter. And once they will really matter, all lives will matter. And I think that is a very important moment, historical moment through that. It's attack the past for a better future. But it look also at together at different things, this moment of light in the current darkness, bringing together the fight against climate change, but also, of course, the decolonization of knowledge, of practices, of institutions. And rural recognition, I was thinking, of course, of the current massive destruction of the earth, right? But also of the farmers' lives being destroyed everywhere. And that their work is to feed and therefore to care about. So how do we really revisit caring and temporality of, you know, the temporality, of course, of the rural versus the current speed economy and the fastness of application. So all this for me, glowing in the dark, you know, was a very rural recognition, was in fact, I found a connection with that. My second remark is about the decolonization of knowledge, which has become, you know, for 5-6 years, extremely important among students in South Africa, Mexico, India, and Europe. And what is pedagogy? What is a new pedagogy? How do we look about how do we learn and how do we teach? And I want to take it, it's a very personal concern for me, and I will go about it through 3 examples. The first one has been, you know, working with artists of color for a while now, with Isaac Julien or Yonke Shonibare or Kader Atia, and working with them of, you know, what is it to talk about the colonial past or about slavery, what is representation, and what is, you know, the question of really working through the difficulty of representing and not doing, you know, just the reverse. That has been very important. My second example would be that working for a museum project on Réunion Island, where I'm from, and to think what would be to build a museum in the 21st century, a Western model, and apply it to a small island, what would be? And so it was to revisit also the place of the object in the museum, the fetishization of the object. If you don't have an object, then you don't have a story, there was no narrative. And what about the people who left no object, or, you know, the little objet de rien, as we say? And I sent some picture of this objet de rien, this daily object that, in fact, for me, are very important and full of wealth. And thinking about the biography object, you know, following Arjuna Padurai work about that. And the third example of this, you know, thinking about a pedagogy, imagining new pedagogy, experimenting in the work I have been doing for the Mellon Project, Humanities Across Border, which is run by the International Institute for Asian Studies. And especially what I learned a lot, you know, from my friend Arti Karwa, who is based in Chennai, and who had worked beautiful work on indigo and other things. And we did workshop in Guwahati, in Mandalay, in Chiang Mai, in Taipei. And it was very important because we really thought through quite often about how do we bring back also the importance of the other senses in learning and teaching, you know, the touch, the smell, the sound, and the question of really of time. Paying attention to all this, you know, how, you know, really working from Paulo Freire, Tagore, but also queer pedagogy today or indigenous pedagogy. I mean, we are really rethinking education. So decolonizing knowledge is not just to have a new list of reading, a new curriculum, but also how do we learn? How do we learn together, collaboratively? How we revisit? And of course, there are a lot of experience about that today, but I think it's very important at a time when humanities and social science are attacked everywhere, and the university as a public institution is attacked, and also art school, where, you know, in a lot of places, classical Western education. And for one of these workshops, I want to say very quickly, I try, you know, to start from a very familiar object. So I start from the banana, and because there is banana everywhere in the world. And from this, you know, tracing all the connection, geographical connection, history, culture, racism, because you do know, perhaps, I mean, in Europe, if you throw a banana on a soccer field, everyone knows that is a racist gesture against any Black players on the soccer field. So why the banana became, you know, the symbol of anti-Black racism. I mean, the place of banana also in the myth, in ritual, in, you know, religious rituals, in cooking, but also in fashion, in music, but also the question today of the chemicals, of pollution, and looking at what happened in Central America or the Caribbean. So that was also a way of trying to find a multidimensional way of learning and teaching. So that was the pedagogy for me, is a very important practice and experiment, to experiment in a new, really new way, and being patient, and being giving time, and leaving, you know, children being really running with their imagination, bringing back the imagination, because even though we think that there is a lot of imagination, that the tools today, the applications on, allow us, there is also an attack on imagination. Don't even dare to think that another world is possible than the one which is given to us. And that in fact, in the dystopia in which we are living, to dare to think something else, to dare to have utopian thinking is for me very important. It's part of that pedagogy. My third remark, because I think, that I'm closing to the 10 minutes, I wanted to talk about the difficulty, challenge, and hope of the decolonization movement today, because we went through many moments of decolonization, but there was a new one today. And the difficulty is that I don't think we cannot, erase century of patriarchal thinking, of exploitation, racism, commodification of life, sexism, in just one move. When we see, for instance, today, how fast things are commodified, or even the cultural appropriation of practices and knowledge that become, that big design names can appropriate and make themselves theirs, So how this are the difficulty, but it's not just out there, it's ourselves, It's how we see, how we learn also, how we teach, how we act, how we are acted also by class, by gender, by race, by color, by religious, ableism. So the question of self-decolonization and collective decolonization are really two central things for me. And I think all the movement of young people everywhere, the aspiration of effectively how we're going to get away, because there is no other way today of keeping the earth alive and ourselves than effectively getting through this difficulty. So the self-decolonization, because myself, I had to get away with what I learned in the French school. I went to the French school because I know it's a French colony, and how, you have to go through that, and also the kind of the lure of success, the lure of, recognition. So, and how we are stuck even with a hegemonic model. We will think of doing just the reverse of it. I'm just thinking of the fact that the question of the Colson statue, that being replaced by a Black woman, so that's fine, but it's another individual replacing an individual. So, but to go back to self-decolonization, because that's maybe the, decolonization, we may understand it better in terms of collective. Self-decolonization is to learn how the way we absorb, the way we adopt also hegemonic thinking. The way it's not enough to say I'm not a racist or I'm not a sexist, but what am I doing every day not to be that? How I'm contributing to anti-racism. And being an anti-racist feminist activist, I know how difficult, because also the division that is being, among us, and how school teaches to be to become stranger to ourselves and to our own culture, to what we are. And so the incredible work we have to do to learn again what we want to be and what is to be an honest person, very. So the self-decolonization to be also, to learn, I would say self-decolonization is also, again, I repeat myself, to learn again to listen, to look, to touch, to smell, to test, all the things, re-education, re-educating ourselves outside of what patriarchy, sexism, racism told us what is to be. So, that will be. So the difficulty I say are, the working against commodification, cultural appropriation. When I say commodification, is how fast even capitalism will absorb what the critic against it, and it transforms it into a slogan that is being sold on T-shirt or whatever. So how do we fight? And the cultural appropriation. And at the same time, the erasure of a lot of knowledge and practices, and, and the question of poverty. The hopes, because I think I'm going, toward the end of my 10 minutes, if I have not even gone over that, is this global movement of young people everywhere, but not just young, because I do think the intergenerational connection are absolutely fundamental for me. But the fact that it's multidimensional, the connection of the fight against environmental destruction, against feminicide, against neoliberalism, against erasure, again, relearning the past differently, rewriting what is to write, new form of narration, new form of representation, going through that difficulty. So I do think that is very also the practice, trying to be horizontal, trying also to rethink. And in terms of art, I'm thinking some years ago with artist Carval, we went to an exhibition in Chennai called Worker of the World, Relax. And it was made mostly by young Dalit artists. And it was very important because it was really about manual work and the difficulty in fact of very few moments that manual work is represented in art. And so it was really beautiful, really fine. So for me, it's to conclude, it's to put an hand to the fabrication of the vulnerability to premature death, which is really what the current regime is about, and also so to dare to go through experimentation, to try, to fail, to try again, to repair, to do a lot of repair, and this is a lot of things I've been thinking with artist Kader Attia. The politics of the living and the politics of loving, and so that it will be for me glowing in the current darkness and trying really to hold for a new form of recognition and a new form of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Françoise. I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of questions that are going to crop up. Now I'd like to introduce Lothar Osterburg. Lothar is an internationally known artist, and fine arts from the Arts Academy in Brunswick and the San Francisco State University. Lothar has received many prestigious awards, including the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship. He is a master of photogravure, a complex process that has few practitioners today, but dates back to the photography's inception. His works are in numerous collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and is represented by the Leslie Heller Gallery in New York. Lothar lives in the United States and teaches at the Pratt Institute in Utica, New York. Lothar?
Welcome, everyone. Hello, and I'm very happy to be on here. I wanted to start very differently. I'm much more of a traditional studio artist, working in my studio by myself. Very happy at the current situation of sequestering myself. I'm sorry, I didn't practice this too much. But what I am doing is I'm working with models that I stage, set up, and photograph. And you can see my vision of the Grand Central Terminal right now. That is very much based on an immigrant experience, and not really the immigrant experience of what I experienced, but more of what the dream of New York or the idea of New York would be if you are intending to immigrate and have the great hopes and aspirations of the immigrant that wants to better their lives. So I'm working not on the real place, but on the fictional New York here. From that, I spun out a lot of different projects, like what you just saw, the Tower of Babel. And I will give you now a few slides of exactly what I'm doing with these. So there are two parts of my start share screen. Good. Which one here? This one. Can you see this? I hope. If not, please let me know. I want to start with this slide, which also tells you how the way I'm working is from memory. That is inspired by various events in my own life. It could be something I read in literature, I saw somewhere, but I'm working from a specific memory. But the memory, what happens with memory is we are having an emotional reaction, but we don't really remember the details. So the details, they kind of fade away, like the dream that fades away when you just wake up, and afterwards you have the feeling and the unease of that dream, but you don't remember all the details. So when I rebuild them as models, I kind of have to substitute with my personal experiences, with collective memory, but also with logic. How can this actually work? So W.G. Thiebaud, in his book from 1990, Vertigo, is actually putting this very beautifully into words. He says, "It was a severe disappointment when some years ago, looking through some old papers, he came across an engraving and was obliged to concede that his recollected vision of the town in the evening sun was nothing but the copy of that very engraving." So this is kind of how I work. My memory is getting replaced and become very personal. So the source image was actually an image that he had seen by Cartège, and it sort of dug itself in my memory. I couldn't find it again. I didn't know where to look and how to look, and I rebuilt it on the left. Paris became Brooklyn, the Gowanus Expressway became a train viaduct, and the vertical became a horizontal, and my gallerist at that time recognized it immediately, so I could find the original. But again, the immigrant experience of New York, of the city that is full of ideas and full of potential, is always there, but always based on ideas and images I've seen elsewhere, which are from a different time. There is a nostalgic aspect to it, and I actually want to talk to that a little bit also later in contact with what Francoise just said. So this is kind of the, I call this series Yesterday's Cities of Tomorrow. So how in the past we looked like, how the future could be, sort of as the ideal, as the dream. But also they are not always based on actual results, but also on already fictionalized ideas of the Grand my Zeppelins in Grand Central, which are based on basically the docking of a Zeppelin on top of the Empire State Building, which never happened. My Tower of Babel, which came out of this, thought about the New York City as an immigrant community, but also as a very vibrant cultural place that, well, is so vibrant because of the influx of all the different cultures. Of basically, New York has representatives of all languages, of all religions, of all philosophic and religious ideas. And I started working with books quite a few years ago, and it finally culminated in this Tower of Babel idea. I collected books which I found on the streets of Brooklyn. Sometimes they've already gotten wet in the rain. People put them out on the sidewalk for people to pick up, to read, because no library wants to collect them anymore. So I started collecting them, and I realized there were a lot of different languages. So I covered this Tower of Babel with book pages from about 25 different languages. And then staged that. These are then printed in a 19th century photographic process called photogravure, which is also very important to me, because photography to me is really just sort of a slick surface. It's just, make-believe. Whereas in photogravure, and I'm actually going to very quickly in a second will explain you the process, because it is pretty unique. It is a process in which the photograph is etched into a copper plate in a three-dimensional manner, and the photograph is in fact etching ink. So the image, glows out of the dark, because the etching ink is much darker than anything that you can get photographically in any other process. So do this, you expose a film positive on a sensitized gelatin pigment paper. So basically paper coated with gelatin that is pigmented with iron oxide, but sensitive to ultraviolet light. It gets exposed and has, as you can see here, very faintly a portrait. This is not my own work. The hardened image that then gets transferred and developed in hot water onto a copper plate that leaves a thicker gelatin in the highlights and a thinner gelatin in the shadows that will then get etched over time. This is now one of my works. And wherever it's dark, it started to etch. Wherever it's orange, it has not started to etch. So it etches into various depths into the plates, up to about 45 minutes difference. So the blacks are really black, hold a lot of ink, whereas the highlights, they will start only in the very end, and then you have the full image in the etched into the copper plate that you then ink up with etching, ink, and print. Again, this is an amalgam of different kind of processes. But I think I kind of stayed within my time, barely. And I will be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Lothar. That was fascinating, and a visit to your studio was very, very special. Thank you. Next of our panelists is Monica Jahan Bose. Monica is an artist and a lawyer holding a bachelor's degree with double major in studio art and mathematics from Wesleyan University, a postgraduate diploma in fine art from Vishwa Bharati University in Shantiniketan, India, and a JD from Columbia University School of Law. Monica is a feminist, environmental activist, and she's a Bangladeshi American who works in performance, painting, film, photography, printmaking, and interdisciplinary projects. She often works in collaboration with rural and urban communities to address issues around gender, climate change, and lives and works in Washington, D.C. and Bangladesh half the year. Thank you, Monica.
Hello, thank you everyone who's watching, and thank you NUZHAT, and really enjoyed hearing the presentations from Francoise and Lothar. I'm going to, Lothar, I'm going to just start a little set of images. Okay. I think I want my desktop, correct? Okay, let's see. All right, are you all seeing it? So I was asked to speak mainly about some of the work that I've been doing for the last 8 years with women from my ancestral village in Bangladesh, a place called Katakali village. It's a project I started, it's a collaborative project. I call it an art and advocacy project. It's called Storytelling with Saris. And my idea was and is to illuminate these voices and work directly with these incredible rural women who are really the repositories of huge amounts of knowledge, and to work with them, learn from them, and present their stories because their stories are very relevant to women's empowerment, to climate justice, all of that. So this is an image from my first set of saris that I made with them in 2013. And let me just show you where the island is. It's in Bangladesh, very south in the Bay of Bengal. And it's an island called Borobaishtia. And the village, Katakali, is in the middle. And it takes about 30 hours to get there from Dhaka by boat. And mainly, actually, for many years, I had done painting and printmaking, mainly painting, printmaking only recently. And this is one of the paintings that I actually did when I was living in Paris, part of my water series. And that image is of my grandmother. The words on the edge are pani and jal, the two words for water in Bangla. It also has some, the beginnings of my interest in fabric, textile work. It has the little sewing stitches on the edge, which were reminiscent of katha stitching that my grandmother used to do. And my grandmother was an incredible woman. She was married at age 7. She was swept away in a cyclone, but she survived. So she's a big inspiration to me. And her house, this is her house on the island. After she died, my mother and others on the island and I worked together to start up a women's cooperative, which is focused on female literacy and environmental sustainability. And I'd been involved in this project for many years. And it had been sort of parallel to my art practice. Sometimes I had done paintings of the people, but then this idea came to me as these women started to learn to read, that actually I should involve them more directly in my work. And at the time I'd been doing installations and performances using saris, and the sari blouse was a symbol that I was using as a symbol of colonialism and women's bodies in my printmaking and my paintings. And I got this idea that wouldn't it be interesting to work with the women of my village and maybe start putting images on the saris themselves. And I spoke with them and they were very interested. So I designed a set of wood blocks based on their feedback. Mainly, a lot of it was about images of vegetables and the words that they've been learning at the time from their adult literacy classes, and went down to the island. First time I had been since my grandmother's funeral. I went back after 19 years with my mother and my 2 children, my 2 daughters, and it's a fishing boat for the last leg of the journey. And you can see there's a little solar panel on that boat. And when I went to the island, you know, we finalized the group of 12 women who would be working with me, and it was just a wonderful experience. And I noticed that a lot of people had solar panels on their roof. And actually, this is Juleka's roof and her children and her family. And she's the one who actually taught me about solar energy. And here I am, and you know, with all this environmental background. But she told me, "Oh, Appa, you don't have one?" And I was so embarrassed. And she told me, you know, how much she spends on it, which is about 1/3 of her income to pay for this panel. And they produces clean energy for her family to read at night. So I came back to Washington and researched it and realized I really, as a wealthy, much wealthier person than them, I should be spending a large chunk of my income on solar panels. And I put these panels on my roof and researched all the energy credits and tax credits I could get, and started having these solar sari salons in my house to try and get my neighbors so we could reduce our carbon footprint and help these people around the world who are being devastated by climate change. So as you may know, Bangladesh is on the front lines of climate change. These women, Borobash Islands is in the front lines, and 30 million people may be displaced in Bangladesh with 1 meter sea level rise. The most immediate concern on the island and the coastal areas of Bangladesh is extreme change in weather, erratic rain, very hot seasons, complete disruption of traditional agricultural knowledge and all the years that they've spent learning when to plant and when to reap. And every year from the village that I in the last 5 years, they've had massive loss of crop. It's really the most devastating thing. So food insecurity is sort of the big issue right now. And of course, displacement is looming as well. And many people have already been forced to move to the cities. So I've been using the saris. So in the beginning, we made 24 saris together. 12 I brought back to exhibit, and 12 I asked them if they would wear them. And when they wore them, would they save them for me? And they did. And I brought the saris back. They came by boat and eventually by plane to Washington. I sewed them together with my daughter into a massive 216-foot sari. These saris contain the women's bodies. They slept in them, they bathe in them, they cook in them. They only have 2 saris. You know, they wear one, they wash it the next day, and they wear it again. And these saris were stitched into this massive sari, and I use it in a series of performances in Washington, in Brooklyn, in Miami, in Miami, and in every place I worked with women, local women, and the idea was to physically connect one group of women with another on the issue of women's empowerment and climate justice. And this was in Miami. I worked with a number of women from a group called 1 Billion Rising. And then I actually ended up, it was a very long performance that ended up in the ocean. And then that sari was later displayed as part of an installation at the Bangladesh National Museum called And Then. And the saris keep being reused. So this is a material that I use in my work. It really speaks to continuity, the circle of life. And the saris saris in general never end. They're kept for generations, and in Bangladesh, we restitch them when they get really thin. We restitch them into layers. We call them kathas, and they're made into baby blankets, and they're used in so many different ways. It's really the most versatile. It's an unstitched, huge 18-foot long thing that's woven on a loom. So it symbolizes many things for me. And then I got this idea that really I need to get Americans to be working on the saris and to teach them about climate change and have them make actual promises to reduce our carbon footprint, because that's the thing that can really help. So I started this thing called Climate in Actions, or Climate Art Actions, in 2015, where I work with Americans. We stand around a sari, they learn woodblock printing from me, a technique I'd learned from the women of my village, and then they make pledges to specific things they can do to reduce their carbon footprint. And then these saris are shared back with the women in Bangladesh. The women read the saris, they wear the saris, so it's this continuous kind of loop, and the saris are used in performances and installations. Here's an image from the women working on a new set of saris last year for the Warming Waters Project, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I keep making new wood blocks with inspiration from the women and from the communities that I work with. So I have a whole bunch of new wood blocks that are about solar energy, that are about storm surge, wind energy. Also the knowledge sharing is a two-way thing. I really believe that I have to do more than make beautiful installations. I try to do workshops with the community in Bangladesh as well. So we did a climate knowledge sharing workshop a few years ago, where they actually learned about the causes of climate change, and they learned some adaptation skills. And one of the ideas that came out of it was to start a coconut nursery. So the women have done this. They have grown 200 coconuts and replanted them, because coconuts, of course, they're trees, they absorb carbon, but also coconuts grip the coastline, they prevent erosion. And when they're on the coastline in like a barrier, they prevent the storm surge. When the big storms come, the surge is much higher than before, hits the wall of the coconuts and goes down. And then, of course, much of my family has survived cyclones by clinging on to the coconuts, and then you can drink the water and eat the fruit afterwards. So it's the most incredible thing. I use the coconut in my work as a symbol of resilience. The coconuts float. And then I've also gone and back, and I've done, last year I did a trash cleanup performance. This island had been pristine, and even in the few years since I've been involved in this project, I've seen that plastic waste, part of this, part of capitalism and colonialism, it's creeping in to the island as well. And of course, there's no system for getting rid of it. But so speaking about the SAMKHYA philosophy, I'm not really a philosopher. I'm an activist, but I found a lot of the themes quite interesting, and I think it's relevant to my work. The concept of liberation through knowledge, I think, is fundamental to SAMKHYA. And I think that we all, I try to learn. I think it's important for us to learn from sustainable lifestyles, from villagers. As Francoise says, the glow, the knowledge actually comes from these, rural and indigenous communities. It's not for us from the West to impart it to them. And I'm also interested in this idea of the satya and essence, the principle of light and intelligence and goodness, which is part of this philosophy. And another thing that interested me was there's a concept of prakriti, or nature, as beginningless, eternal, and infinite in SAMKHYA philosophy. And I do see that as a big thread in my work, my use of the sari. I also refer to the myth of Draupadi in the Mahabharata, the sari, that the woman that can never be disrobed and raped. And so, of course, I see that as a very interesting analogy and metaphor in my work as well.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for preparing and appearing on this webinar. I'm going to ask Helen Frederick to read out some of the questions that you have all thoughtfully posted on the webinar chat site. Cheryl Edwards asks, how do you see artists of color roles in assisting in decolonization of themselves, which will help in the conversation of others? This is addressed to Francoise. So Francoise, if you could unmute yourself and answer the question, that would be great.
Okay, so how do artists of color can go through the decolonization process, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, well, there are many ways, but I will talk about what I've been doing, because that will be perhaps easier. For instance, one of the workshops I did was with 20, 25 young artists of color in France, I will talk about that one. And the point was like the decolonization is, for me, it's through a process, a practice itself. It cannot just be about, talking about it and say, I decolonize myself. So for instance, was to say, how can we work with some constraint and some freedom? The constraint was to do something, a performance in 2 days, with the lowest economy possible, the less expenses. If one needed something and we did not have it, do you have it? Someone else has it at home. We don't have it. What can be replaced? And it was also not just the photographer plus the choreographer plus the performer, whatever, but the collaborative work together. For instance, 2 years ago, I did something around water, because the criminalization of water in Europe, if you give a glass of water to a migrant, you can be accused of being accomplice to smuggling. And of course, also the privatization of water, people dying in water, the fact of, lacking water in some place, drinking water. But the water is absolutely essential for life. And we had 3 groups, and one group was the keepers of water, and they had to keep this very fragile, very threatened, and very necessary element of human life and of life on Earth. And another group was the warriors, because they thought that there was a war being, against humanity, and we have to fight. And the last group was a Cassandra, who warned about the catastrophe to come, but nobody wanted to listen to them. But the point, I do it very quickly. The point was like we did something together in 2 days, so that we have a performance in which we will, all of the group, not knowing exactly what each other have been doing, will find a way of being together, find a way of doing a collaborative public performance at a point. So I would say it's practice. It's really practice. I would say collectively, collaboration, but at the same time, not effectively missing, what you want to do, as we just saw, the beautiful work done around sari and climate change. But the point is also, how do we make it something? For me, decolonization has to be towards social change. Nothing, in the moment we are living, I cannot think of something else. I'm sorry to say, I can't think of, we have to do something to contribute to changing what is going on, especially today with the pandemic and the growing inequalities and injustice. And so hard has been, but very quickly also, I will say that, for instance, I found one of the art today, the mourning, for instance, the very ephemeral artistic things done, for instance, around George Floyd, where George Floyd was lynched publicly, or what is being done in Portland, or what was done also in Mexico City by feminists marching against femicide. That's the song, the incredible vitality, the creativity, even the creativity through which you fight against, the police violence. All this for me is also part of, I will say, artistic practice. How artists are contributing to that multi-sectional, intersecting work.
Thank you, Françoise. There's another question, Lothar, too, actually. Sarah Tanguy would like you to talk about your dream mobile. And I would like you to talk about how your immigrant experience has led you to nostalgia with your epic photogravures, looking at the reminiscence of others, and how you look at those times and cultures and turn it into a more illusionistic statement. Lothar.
Oh, okay. Oops, I can't start my video. It's disabled currently because the host had stopped it. Start my video now. Okay. So yes. So I'm trying here. Let's just go. Hi. So first of all, there's the bookmobile question, which is another project that I have done a while ago. The bookmobile for dreamers, which was this is actually different. A recurring theme are the books, which are to me kind of vessels of vast knowledge. And it sounds like I'm quoting Monica now for the women she's working with. But But it was inspired by the changing way we're looking at books. We're finding things what we're interested in. It's not just the books that are doing that. It's the algorithms, online algorithms from by Amazon. Like if you like this book, you like that book. You may like this book. So, but it makes it very like discovery of something new very hard for us. So it's not longer that, oh, I like this yellow jacket of this book that looks kind of interesting. Let me see what's in there. And you have absolutely no idea what's in there. And it was a 45-minute video project. Most of it stop motion animation with my models, in a collaboration with my wife, Elizabeth Brown, who is a composer and theremin player in this case. She also plays a couple of other instruments, beautiful music, a wonderful musician. So that is very quickly about the Bookmobile for Dreamer. I can post, if I can figure this out, maybe in the group chat, a link to a preview of this Bookmobile. So I'll try to do this after I'm done talking. The other question was about my personal immigrant experience, which, well, as a white German who has never been discriminated against, institutionalized at least, until I cut my hair off. And before that, it happened a few times. But I, had a very easy time immigrating. It was no problem. I went to San Francisco at first, but always looked at the people. It's in California. The Hispanic population is just, very prevalent, and also their desperation. They're it's really the old school immigrants, what the Irish or the Italians had been in New York before, which came to the United States to make a better life for themselves. And I felt like, well, I kind of bypassed this because I was, rather well off German. And so I've always kind of felt a little guilt about that, how I can justify being here and like having been so privileged basically all my life long. So I kind of really looked much deeper into the immigrant experience. And, I do have to reckon, constantly reckon with the idea that, I'm looking at it from the top down, so that I am not the one who's had to struggle really that hard ever. I mean, I had to work hard to make it here because I did not have any support group, but it was, compared to what I see around me, it's like so much easier. So, but I'm trying to kind of keep that idea of this struggle, of that hope alive through my work. That, I'm not sure if I'm answering this question completely right. I have written a couple of other ideas which I wanted to tie in, and I totally lost my, so I hope that kind of answers the question a bit. The other aspect I actually wanted to do about this immigrant experience, we all, that's kind of human nature. We always strive towards moving upwards, moving towards making our lives better, no matter where we are, even if we are already starting from a relatively privileged position. We never really look back. We never look back to the ones who are behind us. We're looking forward, we're striving forward. And I think this is really a time of big reckoning of us having to face the reality of, well, we came this far on the backs of others, on the hard work of others, which were never really compensated. And, and of course, what the last thing I may want to say is the unsaid fact for so far that I am German, and even though I'm post-war born German, but I have my life long carried sort of an inherited guilt with me over what the Germans have done. And, and I always said, never again. And here we are in a country where it is kind of more likely now than it has ever been that it could become again. So not in my work so much, but as in what I say and how I teach and how I talk to my students have changed much more. And and try to make a difference that way. And I admire both Monica and Françoise for your activism in your art. So I wish I had more of that myself, but we're kind of also product of our upbringing and of our own history. And what Françoise, what you say, decolonize yourself, is I think it goes the other way as well, that we as the supposed supreme race, the whites, also have to de-identify, unidentify or re-identify ourselves as world citizens rather than being the top of the heap. So
thank you.
That's kind of, yeah.
Fleming has a question. Monica, I really admire the arc your projects create, drawing connections and sharing knowledge. How do you decide what project to focus on this kind of progressive body of work? Unmute yourself, Monica.
Oh, I'm still muted.
You're fine.
I think I'm unmuted. I think I'm unmuted, right? Thank you for the question. Yeah, so the long-term project, Storytelling with Saris, is continuing, and it'll continue, I think, for the rest of my life. But there are these other projects that I focus on that focus on sort of the issues that really hit me hard. So last year I focused a lot on food insecurity, and I did these installations where I would fill the whole gallery with 40 kilos of rice and do performances around the issue of food. And then I would do a performance where I would cook the food at the end and give it all away to communities that need it. So I'm working a lot on the issue of climate justice and racial justice currently, I mean, from the beginning. But so I've been doing this project that's coming up next week. It's called Warming Waters. It's a big, massive installation on the Washington, D.C. canal, where I'm connecting African Americans in Washington, D.C. with my community in Bangladesh. And so we're working on saris together, videos, and I share videos back and forth. And the idea is to raise understanding between Asian Americans and African Americans, and really and build this, and work together on this issue of climate justice. And a lot of it is, and to illuminate, and we're going to have videos projected. I'm working with an artist called Robin Bell, who's going to project videos of the people in Washington and the people in Bangladesh working on the saris onto the saris themselves as part of this project. And it's been really interesting. People don't have enough exposure to other cultures and races, and so a part of my work is actually to build this kind of global alliance among poor communities of color. So, and to bring these images and faces and hands working like out there on the street, so people can see, that that these are the artists as well. And so the work is continuing, and then sort of every year I pick one or two projects within the big project to work on. And I really am trying to, and also I try to make sure that everyone gets paid. Right, so it's an issue of also redistributing money. So I try to get grants and get everyone that works on the projects paid. So I have a lot of low-income folks, a lot of senior citizens, a lot of people in recovery, all kinds of people. So another idea for me is very important to have access, and all my projects are in places that are physically and economically accessible to everyone. That's my hope.
Thank you. NUZHAT, do you want to complete with some?
I had a question also for Monica, because I don't think everyone is aware when you said that the blouse, it was a colonialist, that everybody understands how the sari was worn originally in the Bengal area. Could you explain that to the audience?
Oh, yes. So the sari is an unstitched garment of 18 feet, and it was worn in Bengal, and certainly in the village my mother's from, just like that, with nothing else. And it was wrapped around the body. It's multiple layers when it's wrapped. And so if women are breastfeeding, you put the baby underneath, and you hitch it up. If you're farming, you make it put it between your legs. So, but during the British colonial era, there was this Victorian notion of modesty and I don't know, changing the, and apparently the people were, the women of, the colonial women and men were shocked by the natives. And so this idea of the sari blouse and the petticoat actually came about during the colonial, and those are the words that are still used in Bangladesh for this undergarment, this long petticoat that's now worn underneath the sari. And the blouse is more and more common now all over rural Bangladesh as well. But originally, you know, my grandmother never wore one. So anyway, so it's an interesting, I found it very interesting that we still use the word blouse and petticoat in Bangladesh. So I started using it in my work. First, it was just a pop art symbol, but it really took on this concept of like also this idea of this colonial garment and, you know, patriarchal garment, this idea of controlling women's bodies. And anyway, so, and it's also being used now in Bangladesh by religious extremists also believe that you should wear full length blouses and maybe even a hijab on top of the sari. But so it's an interesting history of clothing and women and our bodies.
Yes, thank you. That's an interesting subject, I think, for everyone in all cultures, because I think that happened in Africa, that happened in Hawaii, that happened in all kinds of places where women's bodies were clothed when they were not originally. Thank you so much, Monica. Françoise, you have expressed so much, so many things. It's hard to focus on one or two things, but my question was, how do you counteract and educate, particularly museum people, to decolonize? Has this been more of a struggle in Europe than it has been in, say, North America? Could you inform us a little bit about that? You'd have to unmute yourself.
But I did, no? Yeah, it's...
Now you are unmuted.
Is this? Okay. Well, I will say it's an institution, it's very difficult to decolonize. I think it's one of the most difficult institutions to decolonize. It was built so much about the idea of beauty, aesthetic, universality, whether they are in Asia, Africa, the Americas, or Europe, it's a lot, quite the same thing. There is not really, I mean, I will say that in Canada, you have a attempt to really try, you know, especially in Vancouver, working with indigenous people. And so, for instance, it was very interesting because in the museum, some of the objects are hidden because the indigenous people don't want them to be seen. So even though you have still the text explaining, you don't see the object. Or for instance, other indigenous people have, you know, win the fact that they can borrow the object to do their ritual and they give it back. Or some of the objects, for instance, are taken away because the indigenous people have not decided yet if they can be seen or not seen. Or for instance, there were some masks, for instance, that were sold by a chief of the indigenous people tribe at a moment where a colonizer were forbidding potlatch and forbidding other things like that. And so it was a gesture of despair, you know, nothing matter anymore. So I'm giving, you know, my heritage. And the descendants and the grandchildren decided to leave the mask in the museum, but to explain why the ancestor has given them because of exploitation loss, psychic loss, material loss. And at the same time, so the granddaughter, who is an artist, revisited the mask also. So you have different levels, I would say. And even there were also some totems that had been taken to be so they could be saved, because otherwise outside they would be destroyed by the weather. And some of that tribe say that in fact they could have been left outside. They were also made to disappear. I mean, the idea of absolutely preserving is not necessary. So I would say there are different levels that we could approach the question of the museum. But I would say it's the most difficult institution. And especially in Europe now, you have the huge controversy about restitution of stolen objects from Africa, Asia, the Pacific, the Americas. I mean, we know that European museums are built on looting. you know, like huge, whether it's UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, whatever they are. So this question of restitution, most of the museums are resisting a lot because they decide that they are preserving them for humanity. They are the only one capable of doing that, because in this, you know, global flow, they don't know how to do museum and they don't know how to do it well. So I will say it's the most difficult place. And I'm more interested, in fact, in the small museum being built in Africa, for instance, now, or on some part in Asia, that are really made from below, and people decide, the community decide what they want, how they want to preserve, what is to be preserved, and what is the idea of a museum. You know, why do we go to museum, and why should be, you know, the use of a museum. When I work on the museum in Réunion Island, it was on, you know, there was no native population, and it's still a French place, as I say, you know, it's still under French rule. And the French decided that we will start with the moment when the French decided they will colonize that place, right, and bring enslaved people, and then to people from India, China, and everything. And I say, no, we don't start with colonization, we start with the Indian Ocean. Because the people who were brought as enslaved and indentured workers came from very developed civilization. People who have met with each other. Asia has met Africa for centuries before the European arrived in that space. So the Indian Ocean will be our space. Will be so. And the temporality will be the temporality of circulation of ideas, of objects, of myth, of song, of languages. I mean, really the migrant, the pilgrim, the enslaved, the indentured worker, not the big people, you know. And so it was really to rethink. And as I say, the pity is how to get away with without the object. Enslaved did not leave any object. I mean, no object was preserved, you know, was not considered heritage. And so in the Western ideology, there is no story, therefore, you know, there is no narrative. And slavery is always being told through the tool of slavery, the chains, the act of selling, you know, but not the human being. No, I mean, about the human being, the woman, the child, the man, we don't know, as if, you know, that does not exist. And so that person will exist only through the tool of enslavement. So we thought through that, and we say, okay, how we will restitute the life of the human being, not just through the tool of enslavement. You know, like it's for women, how do we speak outside of patriarchy, outside of sexism? Also, you know, how do we represent ourselves? And so this is why we decided no object. We will start from the story, from the memory, from even the lack of memory, from the little pieces that we can pick and choose like that, to retrace some kind of itinerary. Let's say, for instance, a young woman leave Bombay at the time to come in 1853 as an indentured woman in Réunion Island. Who is she? Where she's coming from? What is it? What is she bringing with them as idea, as knowledge? And so in the barracks where people were in quarantine in Réunion, we found plants of curry leaves. And the story is that they were hiding the curry seeds in the hem of their sari. You know, I mean, they were doing. And so when they arrived on the island, they planted them because there was no reason that you had curry leaves in the barrack, you know, in the quarantine barracks. So starting with from this story, whether it's true or not true, but it's nonetheless true because it's being told. So there is a certain truth to it. Then we will then tell the story of that woman, you know, from this curry seed thing. And so the question of curry leaves, the relation with cooking, the relation with this young woman arriving in this island that she knows nothing about. She does not speak the language. And so we could find in the where she's from, you know, where she was taken from, you know, because some of them were taken, they did not go, you know, freely. And so then to retrace what was this village, you know, in Tamil Nadu or Bengal or wherever they were coming from. And so then to nonetheless, so we don't know her story. We cannot tell her biography because we can tell the biography of the place she's coming from. What was the itinerary from that village to the barrack? what was the port she was living? What was this port at the time? What was Chennai at the time? You know, and then the kind of boat she was taken. And of course, we know the the novels about that. I know there have been novels, you know, of course, written about this crossing the ocean. But for us, it would be more okay. Let's keep at bits and memory. Work through the memory. Work through the little traces and fragments, and accept them, not trying to fill absolutely the absence and the lack, you know, and so to do it with little things like that, you know, and so to revisit really what it is, what do you show, how do you show. So I was very interested by what Monica was showing, and this question also, because the question of food is central for me also. How people cook, and the fact that the circulation of spices, the circulation of taste. And I would just say one word. I did a project on Chinese restaurants in Africa. So because through that, to follow the wave of migration, what was the decor of the Chinese restaurant? What was the recipe? Was the recipe in Dar es Salaam different from the recipe in Maputo, and why, you know, and what they brought, and how this was made. And through that, you know, like you enter you know, a story, a narrative, and then a representation of that. So museum, I will not trust so much the institution. I will not trust it. And I will rather try to work through new form of representation of what Lothar has been doing, or Monica and other people, what Monica is doing, I think. And as I say, you know, this show I saw in Chennai, you know, Worker of the World Relax, was very interesting about manual work, was Kader Atia is doing. I mean, I think a lot of artists are working through that now.
Well, thank you, Françoise. I agree with you that food and meals, we always joke in Washington, D.C. that whenever there's a group of immigrants because of a revolution or some other mishap or disaster in a country, we get restaurants from that country. So we're very fortunate. And that's the first experience. And a lot of immigrants are able to make it through food.
And the discussion about how do you cook that recipe? The endless discussion of what you do here versus how do you do there.
Yeah. How to adapt to local tastes, that kind of thing, yes, as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Enough NUZHAT and Françoise and Monica and Lothar.
And I think I join you in thanking, but also thanking Kala Chaupal and the Institut Français for providing this platform for all of us to meet and to discuss. And I know that we'd all be running to find books and catalogs of our artists to continue our experience with them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.